The 19th century is full of many life stories that have been lost or forgotten. In this video we will explore 5 people who you probably haven't heard about. Their histories range from shocking and sad to inspiring. Join me as we explore these forgotten lives who have been kept hidden for too long. We begin with a story about a Louisiana madam who rose from nothing to become a famed millionaire. Lulu Henley, or Lulu White as she was also known, is believed to have been born around 1868 on a farm near Selma in the state of Alabama. However, some historians have cast considerable doubt on this, and in the absence of a birth record, argue that circumstantial evidence suggests that she was actually born years earlier, perhaps in the late 1850s, but most likely during the period of the American Civil War, between 1861 and 1865. She came from a mixed-race background and was termed a quadroon at the time. This term, which is racially insensitive by today's standards, was widely used at the time to indicate someone whose ethnic background was believed to be 1/4 black. She claimed to be a migrant from the West Indies, and thus of Creole descent, but it is unclear if this was accurate or not. There is much about Lulu's life which was invented by her, and at various times she claimed that her family hailed from Cuba, Jamaica, or one of the other many islands of the West Indies. Little is known about Lulu's early life, but it must have been one of considerable deprivation. This, after all, was the period of Reconstruction following the Civil War, a conflict which had utterly devastated the economy of southern states like Alabama, and which took many years to recover from. It may have been the rural poverty which states like Alabama faced in the post-war period which led Lulu to migrate to New Orleans, the main city of the state of Louisiana to the west of Alabama, in the early 1880s. Lulu was possibly barely a teenager at the time. In order to make ends meet, she quickly entered a life of crime. Again, the details of much of this are unclear, but she was arrested on several occasions for acts of petty theft and other misdemeanors. She was also soon working as a prostitute. By the mid to late 1880s, as she entered her adult years, she had amassed a considerable client base, attracting several wealthy clients. Through this work, she also quickly began amassing a considerable amount of money, and by the early 1890s, she had capital to expend. It was this which allowed her to enter into business in such a way which would bring her to the attention of many of New Orleans' citizens. Lulu was living in New Orleans during a very interesting time in its history. The city had emerged in the 18th century as the capital of the vast French colony of Louisiana, which laid claim to much of what we know today as the American Midwest. It became part of the United States following the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, when the United States government purchased the colony from France for $15 million. Thereafter, New Orleans retained much of its French character, with a strong Creole influence owing to extensive migration from the Caribbean to Louisiana. New Orleans expanded quickly in the 19th century, growing from 50,000 inhabitants in 1830 to 150,000 in the 1850s. It was captured by the Union early on in the American Civil War and escaped much of the devastation which other southern states suffered as a result. By the time Lulu arrived at the city in the early 1880s, the population had exceeded 200,000 people. While New Orleans did not become a major industrial city, Lulu's life was shaped by another development here in the 1890s. By the late 19th century, prostitution was prevalent in New Orleans, as indeed it was in nearly all American and European cities to a much greater extent than it is today. In an effort to regulate the trade and create designated zones in which prostitution could be practiced, the municipal authorities of New Orleans passed an ordinance in 1897, which stipulated that prostitution should be limited to a designated area of the city, the famed Faubourg Treme, one of the oldest neighborhoods in the city. It was known at the time as the center of settlement for freed slaves prior to the war and Creole immigrants from the West Indies, while today it is famed for being the center of much of the city's jazz scene. The new designated area became known as Storyville, so named after Sidney Story, the New Orleans politician who had pioneered the legislation to regulate prostitution in the city. He was later horrified to learn that his surname had become a byword for the red light district. It was here in Storyville where Lulu would carry out much of her activities over the next 20 years. Prostitution was regulated here, much like any other industry. Sex workers registered with the city by purchasing what was known as a blue book for 25 cents, through which they advertised their services and were able to operate legally. Lulu was arguably the individual in New Orleans who profited the most from the creation of Storyville as a neighborhood where prostitution could be practiced legally. Her activities in this regard are synonymous with Mahogany Hall. While there were many brothels and parlors in Storyville, Mahogany Hall was believed to be the most lavish of all of them. Located at 235 Basin Street, it was a mixed-race brothel which employed somewhere in the region of 40 prostitutes at a given time. Mahogany Hall was built at Lulu's direction at an enormous cost of $40,000. It was a 4-story brothel with 15 rooms with private baths and 5 parlors. The rooms were lined with mirrors and mahogany furnishings and surfaces, while marble flooring was used in the common area.
Don't start a business, buy an existing business. You don't have to be a rich investor with bag
areas, along with a winding staircase and even an elevator. Thus, Mahogany Hall was built to the highest standard and clearly identified itself as being for the wealthier clientele from the beginning. While Lulu had amassed a significant amount of money herself in the 1880s and 1890s, the amount of money involved in the brothel's construction, which would be well in excess of $1 million in today's money, was considerable, and it seems likely that she had the financial backing of business or political interests in the city as well to aid her. After opening its doors in the early 1900s, Mahogany Hall quickly began to generate enormous amounts of money. Lulu lived lavishly in tandem, purchasing the finest clothing and jewellery, and acting as the host of the establishment. Such was the extent of her expenditure that she became known as the Diamond Queen of the Demimonde, and would often appear as the host at Mahogany Hall wearing a red wig, topped with a tiara, and brandishing diamond rings on every finger. The services offered at Mahogany Hall were advertised through the Blue Book and a separate Red Book, and brochures distributed at Lulu's behest. Thus, we find the listing for number 235 North Basin Street in the early 1910s, which lists Lulu's name at the top of every entry for the address, and then lists Annie Stone, Emma Sears, Irene March, Corinne Valerie, and so forth. Lulu, who by this time did not work as a prostitute herself, but solely as Madame of Mahogany Hall, also turned the venue into one of the most noted jazz venues in New Orleans. During the 1900s and 1910s, early jazz pioneers such as Jelly Roll Morton and Joel King Oliver, the latter of whom would later mentor the great Louis Armstrong, played at Mahogany Hall. Armstrong himself was born in the neighborhood in 1901, and later immortalized Lulu's brothel in the title of the song, Mahogany Hall Stomp. Lulu's business ventures and activities eventually extended beyond Mahogany Hall and prostitution. For instance, in 1912, she used some of the profits from Mahogany Hall to open a saloon called Lulu White Saloon at 1200 Bienville Street on the corner of Basin Street, and just a stone's throw away from Mahogany Hall. In 1906, she also headed out west for a time to California. Here she demonstrated her shrewd business sense by investing in the emerging industry of filmmaking, which was in its first stages of development in a place called Hollywood on the outskirts of the city of Los Angeles. However, while she had spotted the potential of the industry, her efforts to acquire one of the largest film studios which was being developed here came to naught as she was undercut by a business partner who betrayed her while acting as her agent in California after she returned to Louisiana. The failure to acquire a stake in one of Hollywood's large studios in the mid-1900s was just the first of several setbacks which Lulu suffered business-wise in the 1900s and 1910s. Eventually, Storyville was shut down by the government during the First World War. Following America's entry into the war in 1917, the US Navy deployed most of its resources to port cities like New Orleans. The Secretary of War Newton Baker became concerned that prostitution there was distracting troops bound for Europe, and so in late 1917 he pressured the municipal government into rescinding the 1897 law concerning Storyville. Thus, prostitution effectively became an underground trade yet again in New Orleans in 1917. Mahogany Hall declined sharply thereafter as its business activities became illicit. The building went into a period of steady decline and was eventually sold in 1929 for $11,000, a fraction of the $40,000 it had been built for, especially when inflation is taken into account. The plush interior had evidently diminished considerably over the years as the new owner, a local department store owner, used what had been New Orleans' most upmarket brothel as a storage room for his shop. This was not Lulu's only headache from a business perspective. In 1919, the United States Congress passed the Volstead Act, which paved the way for the prohibition of alcohol in America in 1920. Thus, Lulu's other major business, her saloon on Bienville Street, also had to change its business model in 1920. She turned it into an establishment selling soft drinks. Evidently, she did not accept these new realities easily. We have a mugshot of Lulu after she was arrested in 1920. Here we find a woman who was probably in her late 50s or even her early 60s, suggesting that she was indeed born sometime prior to 1868, as speculated earlier. Yet, every setback can create an opportunity. Like a great many other former saloon owners and purveyors of alcohol, Lulu Henley became a bootlegger in the 1920s, producing alcohol, primarily in the shape of spirits like rum and whiskey, in illegal stills in New Orleans and the wider state of Louisiana. While her operation was clearly not as great as Al Capone in Chicago or Lucky Luciano and Mayor Langsy in New York and New Jersey, Lulu became a significant figure in the Louisiana crime world, created by the Prohibition. She was monitored by the authorities, and while they repeatedly arrested her on charges of bootlegging and, quote, running a disorderly house, nothing ever stuck, and she managed to avoid any lengthy incarceration. Exactly what happened to Lulu Henley in the end, like much of her earlier life, is shrouded in mystery. Some historians in New Orleans believe that she died in 1931, at the residence of another former madam in the city, Willie Piazza. However, there is conflicting evidence on this, and a bank teller at the National Bank of New Orleans later testified that a Lulu White had made a large withdrawal from the financial establishment in 1941. If nothing else, this testifies to the manner in which Lulu Henley became one of the legendary figures of early 20th century New Orleans. Conversely, Mahogany Hall was eventually demolished in the 1940s, though the first floor of Lulu's saloon on Bienville Street is still standing today as much as it was when the Madame of Mahogany Hall first built her business empire here. Lulu's life has been portrayed in popular culture on several occasions. As the New Orleans historian Al Rose noted in his 1970 book on Storyville, the character of Mae West from the 1934 film Belle of the 90s was clearly inspired by Lulu, but owing to the pervasive racism of American society at the time, any racial references were removed from the film. Numerous subsequent films down to the 1970s had characters which were also based on her. For our next story, we are going back to 19th century Congo, where a young man was taken from home and exhibited like an animal.
Listing your house on the market isn't the only way to sell your house. Selling to us is much faster.
Otto Benga was born sometime around 1883 in the forest near the Kasai River in the broad expanse of the Congo in Central West Africa. Benga was born as a member of the Mbuti people, a sub-Saharan African people who are genetically disposed to having a short stature. It was this which later led to Benga being taken to the United States, in addition to the tendency of the Mbuti to sharpen some of their teeth into fangs, a look which gave Benga a savage appearance, to white Westerners of the early 20th century. This was a brutal period in the region's history. During the so-called scramble for Africa, which the European powers were engaged in to acquire colonies across the continent, King Leopold II of Belgium had claimed the Congo as his own personal fiefdom. Between the 1880s and the 1900s, a savage system was implemented by the Belgians here, with plantations generating huge profits for Leopold back in Europe. In particular, rubber was hugely sought after, and ivory from elephant tusks. But the Force Publique, a kind of quasi-military police force which Leopold established to administer the colony, used extremely brutal methods, often decapitating Congolese workers who were effectively enslaved if they failed to meet production targets. Those who were adjudged to have taken rubber or ivory for themselves had their hands chopped off. Conditions in the work camps were correspondingly brutal, and there was an exceptionally high mortality rate. Over a quarter of a century, perhaps as many as 1 million Congolese people were murdered through Leopold's regime. Benga was a victim of this carnage himself. We know few of the specific details, but he had apparently married quite young, while effectively a teenager. He and his wife had children quickly, but these were murdered by the Belgian regime at some stage in the early 1900s. Benga only survived himself as he was on a hunting expedition with the Mbuti tribe from which he hailed, when the Belgians attacked his village, killing his wife and children. Thus, Benga had already experienced great trauma in his early life, owing to the actions of white Westerners. But more was to follow. In 1903, an American businessman and explorer by the name of Samuel Phillips Werner arrived in the Congo. His appearance there would have grave implications for Benga. According to Werner's own account of what happened in later years, he purchased Benga for a pound of salt and a ream, or bolt of cloth. His goal was always to exhibit Benga at the World's Fair, which was to be held in St. Louis in the state of Missouri in the United States in 1904. Werner had been specifically hired to travel to Africa in order to obtain a so-called pygmy, what contemporaries believed were a subspecies of human, akin to dwarves. Following the publication of the findings of Charles Darwin several decades earlier with his landmark study on the origins of species, published in 1859, contemporaries were anxious to find supposed missing links in the evolutionary chain between modern humans and primates, such as monkeys and orangutans. In a typical racist trope of the time, people often believed this semi-evolved primate or half-man was possibly living in the wilds of Africa, a continent about which so much was still unknown in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The Mbuti people, with their small stature and fanged teeth, would appeal to Werner as people who could possibly be passed off as pygmies at the World's Fair. To conduct this work, Werner had been paid $8,500, a considerable sum for the time, to acquire several oddities of this kind for the World Fair and bring them back to America to be exhibited there. He chose Benga owing to his physical characteristics. Standing at just 4 feet 11 inches and weighing just over 100 pounds, he was small enough to pass for a pygmy back in America. Moreover, with his sharpened fanged teeth and Congolese manners, Benga would make an impression on the hundreds of thousands of visitors to St. Louis. Having acquired Benga and several other individuals, effectively as slaves, decades after the practice had allegedly been abolished throughout the Western world, Werner headed back to America. The following year, in 1904, the World Fair was held between the 30th of April 1904 and the 1st of December 1904. While such world fairs were often designed to showcase an extensive range of technological marvels and other societal accomplishments, Benga was exhibited as part of a large menagerie of humans from across the world, one which included Native Americans, Filipinos, and Africans, the most famous perhaps being the Apache Indian chief Geronimo, a medicine man and warrior who in the second half of the 19th century had led Native American efforts to resist the colonization of the region of the United States, approximating to New Mexico and Arizona. Benga was exhibited here as a pygmy, but the attempted ruse was soon being ridiculed. A newspaper editorial at the time remarked that, "We do not quite understand all the emotion which others are expressing in the matter. Otter Benga, according to our information, is a normal specimen of his race or tribe, with a brain as much developed as are those of its other members." Thus, despite Werner and the organizers of the fair's efforts to portray the 4 foot 11 inches tall Benga as an example of the missing link in the evolutionary chain, few were entirely convinced. Benga did not take his parading in St. Louis lightly, and there are reports of him resisting Werner and his captors during the course of the exhibit in St. Louis. Indeed, he and his
This $64 high-tech device is the last allergy relief tool you'll ever buy. The average
his fellow Africans caused such unrest that at one point, the 1st Illinois Regiment, a division of the United States military, had to be called in to quell the disturbance. Benga had obviously impressed Geronimo during this quarrel, and so the Apache chief gave the African one of his arrowheads as a token of his respect. With the World's Fair drawing to a conclusion in St. Louis, Werner doubted what he would do with Benga. At first, he travelled back to Africa along with many of the other Africans who had been brought to America for the World's Fair. But his time back home was troubled. He quickly married for a second time, and his new wife just as quickly died, this time from a poisonous snake bite. Moreover, Benga could not readjust to life in Africa, and when Werner set off on his return journey to America, Benga made the curious decision to travel with him. There he briefly found some work and lodgings in the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. But a dispute arose here before long between Werner and the museum's curator, Henry Bumpus, over the salary which had been requested for Benga. A more lasting solution, though, seemed to have presented itself in an offer from the director of the New York Zoological Society, which was primarily charged with the running of the Bronx Zoo in New York City, when the director there, William Hornaday, offered to give Benga a job looking after certain African animals, which Hornaday believed Benga would be naturally disposed to get along with. However, before long, Hornaday noticed that guests to the zoo were more interested in Benga than they were in the animals he was looking after. As a result, he decided to make an exhibit out of Benga. The first day of the exhibit was on the 8th of September 1906, and visitors could find Benga in the monkey house. A sign on the exhibit read, "The African Pygmy Otter Benga, age 23, height 4 feet 11 inches, weight 103 pounds, brought from the Kasai River, Congo Free State, South Central Africa, by Dr. Samuel P. Werner, exhibited each afternoon during September." At the Bronx, Benga was imprisoned in an iron cage. This had been installed at the side of a much larger enclosure which housed the zoo's primates. The implication here was that Benga was a little more evolved than the orangutans and monkeys he resided next to. The conditions here were cruel. As a native of sub-Saharan Africa, Benga was used to warm climates, but this part of the zoo was deliberately kept cool, as the cold temperatures agitated the primates and led to them acting out in a way which generated interest from visitors to the zoo. Perhaps the only thing that gave Benga a bit of happiness was that he became fond of an intelligent orangutan named Do Hong, who could perform tricks and imitate human behaviour. From the very outset of his captivity there, Benga's displeasure at his predicament was plain for all to see. Newspaper articles of the time describe him as glaring menacingly at visitors to the zoo. However, the zoo director, William Hornaday, defended the decision to install Benga there, arguing that it paralleled similar exhibitions of humans which were held in Europe during the 19th century. While Hornaday defended his decision to exhibit Benga at the Bronx Zoo, the appearance of the Mbutu tribesmen there was soon generating some controversy. Having learned of it, African American clergymen and other interested parties in New York City and wider afield protested to the zoo bureaucrats and other civic officials. In particular, the criticisms of Reverend James M. Gordon, a supervisor of the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum in Brooklyn, carried weight. He soon impressed on the mayor of New York, George B. McClellan Jr., that Benga's condition was inhumane and a betrayal of black Americans. Consequently, later in 1906, Benga was removed from the exhibit at the Bronx. His tribulations did not end there though. Although Benga wanted to return to his native Africa, he could not acquire the funding or the means to do so. As a result, he spent the next several years in various locations in the United States, finding occasional work. Firstly, this was at the Bronx Zoo, until his continued presence there was deemed unsuitable. Then, he was released into Gordon's care and placed in the Brooklyn orphanage, which he supervised. Then finally, in 1910, Gordon arranged matters so that Benga could begin working at a tobacco plantation in Virginia. In order to make him seem more normal for his surroundings, Gordon arranged to have Benga's fanged teeth capped at this time. He had also learned to speak English by this point. However, Benga's desire to return home remained unabated, and it was his hopelessness at the inability to do this which caused him the final tragedy in his life. Benga had been planning to return home for several years, when in the summer of 1914, the First World War erupted across Europe. As it did, shipping routes across the Atlantic became more perilous, and non-vital trips were often suspended. Consequently, there was little prospect of Benga being able to find passage from America to Congo in the short term. His despair led to his suicide. On the 20th of March 1916, at the age of about 33, Benga engaged in a ritualistic suicide. He built a ceremonial fire, removed the caps which had been placed on his teeth several years earlier, and killed himself with a gunshot wound to the chest. He was buried in an unmarked grave in Lynchburg, Virginia. Otter's story is one which encapsulates many of the cruelties of this time, an age in which